to answer them. So again, you have joined us for the Humanities in Class webinar series titled To Live and Defy in LA, New Approaches to Teaching Hip Hop History. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Felicia Viator from San Francisco State University. I should say before I turn the microphone over to Felicia that we're also joined tonight by TAC member Gerald Evans. Gerald is a Ohio guy living in Richmond, Virginia, and he has done a lot of research after reading the professor's book around resources and materials that you'll be able to use in your teaching. He's going to be dropping links in the audience chat box and also asking questions and just generally keeping things lively, as Gerald often does. So please do lean on him too as you engage in this conversation. So with no further ado, Felicia Viator, thank you so much for joining us, particularly today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Andy. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it.
Sure. So Felicia, in a moment, you're going to start the PowerPoint and you'll talk with us about your book and your work. But I would like to start actually by asking you to talk to us a little bit about what I may, you know what, if it wasn't today, here's the question I would have asked if today didn't happen. I would have said, hey, Professor, how does, this professional grade academic historian, we all walk through the conferences, we all know academics and scholars who, have a very traditional approach. How do they respond to the work that you do? And instead, what I'm going to do is ask that question similarly by saying, all these teachers with us tonight who are going to be turned on and understand this topic better, how can these approaches help them as they approach the contemporary 2021 U.S. in their classrooms? Why should we worry about hip hop scholarship?
Right. How do we connect what we're going to talk about today to what's going on now?
Just in general, not necessarily DC right now, but just in general.
Right. Well, my plan today is to talk about teaching hip hop history and the best way to do that. And I will try to talk about the ways rap music has functioned as something radical and how it has in various ways informed Black protests, especially around police violence. But, I've been thinking about this a lot today. Not just today, but over this week and over the months through 2020. I think there's a way that, what we're talking about today in terms of teaching hip hop history can be connected to the way that we are perceiving what's happening right now, especially what's happening in DC today, and and how we're all reacting to these efforts to overturn the election. Because, if we teach American history, if we teach it by foregrounding the Black experience, if Black perspectives are central to how we teach big themes like democratic institutions and westward migration and the progressive era and the Reagan era, then our students' understanding of the American past will be just more complete, and they will have a fuller context for understanding a moment like this. So they'll have a better way to understand and recognize what Black folks recognize every day, that unequal treatment under the law is part of the American story, or that concerted and even sort of these wildly egregious efforts to disenfranchise Black voters, that's also part of the American story, or that Black organizing to assert political power, which of course we're seeing in full color in the face of white resistance, is also a part of the American story. And what we're seeing today is that, this nation's not very old experiment to create and strengthen its democracy is as much a Black story as it is an American story. So, my feeling is like we should be teaching American history the way W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about American history, with Black perspectives front and center. And so teaching hip hop history is an opportunity for us to do that because, of course, hip hop is a fundamentally Black art form. So when we teach this history, we're putting Black forms of expression and Black perspectives and Black youth in particular at the center of our teaching. And I just, the case that I'll be making today is that I really think that we should be doing more of that. We should really be folding the Black experience into our U.S. history survey courses, into our the courses that are covering these big American history topics. So, this is the way I've been thinking about today's topic in the context of, all the wild things that are happening right now. It's a way that, I'm thinking about it in the way that I think about when I teach. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I think it helps. I think it helps a lot. And I think, as the audience, as our participants, as our colleagues tonight sort of process what we're sharing and then perhaps go back and listen to the recording, I think it gives some really clear articulation for the why. And sometimes, we all make choices when we close the door and start teaching, but that why is usually pretty central. So I really appreciate you articulating that for us.
Sure, no problem. Do you want me to kick it off?
You're ready to go. Absolutely.
We're ready to go? Okay. Well, I do want to thank all of you for coming. Andy and I talked earlier about how much you all are juggling, especially I know many of you are in LA, and I know it's tough right now, so I hope everybody is safe and feeling okay and managing. It's a very busy week, I'm sure, also because for many districts, schools are back in session. So I just really appreciate you all joining us here during what I know is a very, very busy, hectic week, even before the events of today. So I've been looking at the chat. I love some of the conversations already about the videos that Andy played in the introduction. And I'm also curious how many of you are currently teaching hip-hop history in your classrooms or how many of you plan to teach it in the future. So if you're comfortable sharing that in the chat, I would love to see that. I'd love to know that, and I'll keep my eye out for your responses. So I have been thinking about how we teach hip-hop history for a very long time, in part because I have a personal connection to the way hip-hop first became a tool for educators many years ago. I am a historian now, but my first career was actually as a hip-hop DJ in the San Francisco Bay Area. This was back in the late 90s when I was a student at UC Berkeley, and at that time there were a bunch of us who were performers, we were students, some of us were teachers, and we connected with folks across the Bay in San Francisco at San Francisco State to build the original college course on hip-hop. So that San Francisco State hip-hop course was really the first of its kind, and it helped create a blueprint for bringing hip-hop into the classroom. And it even created a blueprint for me when I started teaching after college. I stayed involved in teaching in middle schools. I taught a DJ technology class for kids in a middle school in East Oakland. I assisted a teacher in a hip-hop creative writing course at San Quentin through the Prison University Project for about a year. And then later, when I started teaching my own courses at UC Berkeley, I integrated stories about rappers into my American history curriculum with a little bit of resistance from faculty and administrators, but eventually folks came around. And now, even my kids at their schools, their teachers are using hip hop to teach the humanities in lots of different ways. So it's full circle for me. And I'm sure many of you have noticed the same kinds of changes at your own schools and universities or at your kids' schools. So the way hip hop has become standard in our classrooms over the last 20 years is this really significant thing for the reasons I just mentioned, because it means we're putting Black art at the center of our teaching. And that's critical. It's critical for me as an American historian in particular. But I'm going to make the case that we're not maximizing those opportunities the way that we could. I'm going to make the case that we've been too limited in how we've been teaching hip-hop history, which means, I think, that we've been missing the chance to really help our students gain a full understanding for why hip-hop history really matters. So that's my preface, and then this is the basic plan for tonight, this outline here. I will start with some observations. We'll discuss the old standard hip-hop history narrative. I'll suggest some ways that that old story should be re-examined and why it could be re-examined. And then I'll offer some ways for us to do that. So I'll talk a little bit about YG in a moment, but that is Compton rapper YG there. It's actually a screenshot from a video he filmed in 2020 for his song FTP, which is an acronym for F the Police. I don't know if I can swear, so I won't. But that is a screenshot from that video he filmed right around the time of the George Floyd protests. I'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. So I did want to point out, let me make sure that I'm scrolling correctly here. I did want to point out some of the resources that I provided. In the pre-reading, I added some articles and some music videos, and this Spotify playlist over here on the right, which covers mostly LA rap history, in case you're interested, especially those of you that are in LA, grew up in LA, you might find that interesting. I also added a Google Doc with a list of additional resources, including, I wanted to point out, a series of DJ mixes by some friends of mine from the Rub in Brooklyn. Each of the mixes in that link cover 1 year of rap from, I think it's 1979 to the present. So a great resource, in my opinion, in terms of sort of getting a snapshot for every year of rap music way back, from way back. And then I also recommended some films, including these here. If you're not familiar, United Skates, On the Record, Hip Hop Evolution, ATL, those are all documentaries, and I found them all very, very useful in the college class. So recommend them there if you are teaching at the university level. And then if you're teaching in high school, I think these can be fantastic resources too. There are references in those documentaries to things like gun violence and sexual abuse. That's the main theme of On the Record in particular, so heads up there. Then, of course, Boys in the Hood and Do the Right Thing, those are not documentaries, they're feature-length movies, and they are, of course, R-rated, mainly because of violence and sex. So pulling clips from those might be best, especially if you're not teaching college. And I wanted to point that out in particular because I'm recommending some explicit material. And when we teach hip hop, we are dealing with some explicit material, naturally. And I thought it would be useful because of that to talk a little bit about best practices for teaching explicit material in the classroom. I've navigated this myself in my own teaching many times. But I really had to reflect on this recently when I wrote this piece for the Washington Post, this piece on the right. I was looking for a way to help the Post readers understand the history of NWA's song F the Police. Of course, the reference that's in that banner there that the protesters are holding. I wanted to help the Post readers understand that song in the context of Black Lives Matter protests. And ironically, in case you haven't read the article and didn't notice this, I ran into the problem of language and censorship. So the Washington Post, of course, couldn't allow me to spell out the F word in the article, even though the article was ultimately about the power of that word uncensored. But in the end, the fact that we had to sort of star out the word, we had to star out the UC in the word, ultimately it helped me highlight the point the protesters were making by using the uncensored word to get the public's attention, in conjunction with calls to defund the police, which, by the way, is something that the historian Austin McCoy has talked about in detail in one of the webinars in the series from a few months ago. And I have to say, speaking of this song and that slogan that has been picked up, again in the last few years, not just in 2020, but thinking about in the 1980s, the organized response from the National Police Union and from the FBI to that song, to NWA's song and those lyrics, the warnings that police and federal officials relayed about the threat that NWA posed to civil society because of those lyrics, it really, I think, puts into perspective why that slogan resonates among Black Lives Matter protests in particular. And I think it puts into perspective the limp response to the real and actual threat to our democratic society that is happening right now. So, just to sort of, again, try to connect the kinds of things that we're talking about today to what's going on all around us. So in our classrooms, we, of course, have a responsibility to protect our students, especially our youngest students. But like I tried to do with this article, I think we have to figure out how to help students engage with the art as it was intended to be experienced. So there's a way in which I think for best practices, when teaching hip hop history, it's almost as if we have to make the issue of censorship its own curricular topic. We have to deal with this, right? And I've dealt with it a few ways myself, so I can quickly list those and recommend them. One way I've dealt with this is by blocking out the words, especially in slides, which is I had tried to do here, but I think with the way in which the slides moved over, the block that I had over that first word moved, which is great. It's great that these kinds of accidents happen and that we deal with them in the classroom. There's a way that you can censor words so that students can guess what's behind the block, so that you can have a discussion based in their understanding of what's actually there. So that's one strategy I've used fairly successfully in the college classroom. Another strategy I've used is to have students examine something that's thought to be obscene, quote unquote obscene, by exploring how the public reacts to it. So, even if you share an edited version of a song, I did this recently with the Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion song WAP. You in the classroom setting, you may not be able to share the dirty version of that song or the dirty version of the video, but students can get a sense for the objectionable content in the music by listening to things like the artist interviews, or they can read music reviews, they can read letters to the editor, they can even look at tweets that you pull for them for discussion. So there's a way that you can have you can have a useful discussion, and you can sort of do a roundabout approach to talk about even the most explicit kind of material in the classroom, in order to put it into historical context and get at the significance of it. And then another strategy which I've used recently is I sometimes just pull back the curtain on my own teaching and just talk openly with students about the hesitations I have about teaching particular songs. And I even ask students, if they were in my position, what songs would they be hesitant to teach and why, which often creates really interesting discussions. So my point is just what I mentioned, that thinking about best practices in terms of explicit material, I think it's important to make censorship its own curricular topic when we teach hip hop, rather than just something that we work around. And then lastly, I just want to briefly mention my book, which I offer up as a teaching resource as well. I wrote this book with a broad audience in mind, including young adults. So I think that passages from it could be used in the high school classroom and absolutely in the college classroom. It could also be used, I think, to prep lessons on, of course, the origins of West Coast rap, but also things like policing, the history of music videos, or even more generally, the history of pop culture in the 1980s. There is a lot in the book beyond the story of LA rap, I promise. And I did include a portion of chapter 1 in the example, in case you're interested. All right, so this last year, I got curious. After my book came out, some colleagues reached out to me to ask advice about hip-hop lessons. And then around the same time, I was invited by my department to build a new hip-hop history course for San Francisco State. The original hip-hop culture workshop that I mentioned earlier is still offered at SF State, but we thought there might be a space for a course that specifically covered history. So I was really excited about this because I felt like 2020 had presented really potent arguments for teaching the history of rap music as this enduring cultural force. I mean, most obviously, rap music was part of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations this last year, and I should say, since the creation of the Black Lives Matter movement, hip hop has been a part of it. You had this last year in 2020, you had protesters like this young woman here on the left who were using images of rappers like LA's Nipsey Hussle, that's who's on her shirt, the late rapper from Crenshaw. She's using that image, and others were using images of rappers like Tupac, for instance, to reinforce their messages about injustice. And then rappers themselves, like YG, like Megan Thee Stallion, they were also inserting themselves into debates about police reform and political action, mostly on the left, not always, as we saw with rappers like Ice Cube. So music was, in the protests in that way, and it also proved to be a vehicle for protest in other ways that were less obvious. So YG, again, he had a 2016 song, FDT, which was an acronym for F Donald Trump. And that 2016 song went viral in 2020, just a few months ago, weeks before the recent presidential election, thanks to YG fans who filmed themselves sort of blasting this song from their cars while driving alongside various flag-waving and Trump caravans. And I actually witnessed this firsthand. I got stuck in the traffic of one of these caravans out in San Ramon, which is sort of east of Oakland, up in Northern California, and stuck in one of these caravans and watched this young woman pull off. She parked her car alongside of the road. She opened up all her windows and she played YG's FDT full blast, just staging her own individual protest with that rap song. So fans themselves are using this music as a way to protest, as a way to speak up. So there were a lot of examples for me for how 2020 presented obvious ways to use hip-hop as a lens for talking about a whole bunch of things, including policing, including politics. And so this was a point from which I thought, as a history teacher, I could work backward. I could ask my students this question: how do we get here? By sort of the way that I teach hip-hop history. So I started to draft some curriculum, and when I build a curriculum, I like to see what other professors are doing. So I survey syllabi, as many as I can get my hands on, to see things like what readings people are assigning, how teachers are structuring lessons, all of that sort of thing. And since I had a hand in some of the earliest hip-hop course curriculum, I knew what teachers were assigning back in the early 2000s. And so what I really wanted to do was I wanted to pinpoint what had changed since then. Hip-hop music, and some of you have been talking about this in the chat, which is so great. Hip-hop music is constantly changing, right? It's constantly reinventing itself. It's always in flux. This is something I had to respect deeply when I was a working DJ. I had to stay on top of how the music changed because I needed to fill dance floors. I needed to keep getting gigs. So I had to stay on top of things in that way. And now, as a historian, I wanted to see how the curriculum was following along with these changes. And what I found in surveying syllabi was that, unlike the music, the curriculum had not evolved much. And what was clear to me was that the teaching was taking cues from the dominant scholarship on hip-hop history, which itself hadn't changed much over the last 15 or 20 years. So the key stories in much of that scholarship and the sort of main structure of the history seemed to be frozen in time, which for a historian like me is really strange, because part of what we do as historians is we examine scholarship from the past. So we examine the past, of course, but it's equally important for us to look at what scholars have said about the past, because by doing that, we see what needs updating, or we see what arguments might not hold up, and then we go and we fix those things to make sure we're getting it right, to make sure we're telling a fuller, more accurate story about the past. And I just wasn't seeing a lot of that happening in the field, and I could see that reflected in the curriculum, the way the curriculum didn't seem to be changing. So what I'm going to do tonight is try to provide some ideas for how we as teachers and as scholars, if they're here, teachers and scholars of hip-hop history, how we can move in that direction to give our students and our readers a fuller picture of this past. So I do think that before we jump into how we revise curriculum, I think it's important for us to explore that frozen in time story. So this is a story that we're probably all very familiar with by now. This is a story that starts in the late 1970s in the South Bronx in New York. One of the key historical figures here is DJ Kool Herc, of course, who pioneered this scene that brought DJs and MCs and breakdancers and graffiti artists together. And in this classic story, things start, of course, in the streets of the South Bronx, and then from there you have the music and the dance and the art. All of that culture moves downtown and then into the other boroughs of New York, where it becomes hip-hop and eventually spreads to other parts of the country. Now, the other key character here in this classic story, as many of you I'm sure are familiar with, is Afrika Bambaataa, who through his own music and his work as a community leader in the South Bronx, he becomes a spokesperson for the culture, right? And more specifically, Bambaataa becomes a spokesperson for the so-called four elements. So the forms of hip-hop expression that I just mentioned, so DJing, MCing, breakdancing, and graffiti writing. Bambaataa helps give hip-hop culture its shape by explaining it as made up of those four elements, or those four pillars, really. And all of that is tied to New York and its youth culture. So here you have, in this standard narrative, you have an origin story of hip-hop that's dependent upon a New York perspective and on a particular definition of what constitutes hip-hop culture that's directly tied to those block parties and the b-boy ciphers like you see here in these slides, and to the graffitied subways of New York, right? So in this classic story, you have the MC, the DJ, the breakdancer, the graffiti artist. Those are the four essential ingredients. And it's those four elements that supposedly guide the development of hip-hop as it spreads across the globe. Now, from there, the standard story, the standard narrative, charts that early rise to hip-hop's quote-unquote golden era of the 80s and 90s, which is also largely a New York story. So out of this comes something that hip-hop scholars have called quote-unquote politically conscious hip-hop, with East Coast rappers like Public Enemy and KRS-One, as you see here, as kind of the model examples of this. And KRS-One, by the way, it's an acronym for Knowledge Reigns Supreme Over Nearly Everybody, and anybody who's over 35 knows how to finish that lyric. So these are artists who broke ground lyrically and musically, right? They represented in their art everything from racial uplift, like Public Enemy did, and justice for the poor, like KRS-One did, things like female empowerment, like Queen Latifah, global decolonization. So a whole bunch of things that sort of make up the definition of this golden era and give it that politically conscious label. And students have learned about this era for decades now as sort of peak hip-hop consciousness, when rap music educated the public and when it had this very clear purpose. And then after this peak era, something else happens, right? So what happens after this era? MC Hammer happens, and Vanilla Ice happens, and Puff Daddy and Mace and the era of the shiny suit happens. What happens in this standard arc, the standard narrative of the story, is that the golden era gets smothered by capitalism, right? So a new crop of artists who seem only to have commercial success on the mind, they take center stage, and the commercial industry takes over, which ultimately dilutes, quote unquote, true hip hop. So that's what happens. That is sort of the the dun-dun part of the story, right? And then, you have this dramatic shift in the standard narrative. And it's something that hip-hop scholars and hip-hop writers have cited again and again. But it's also something that hip-hop artists at the time called out. So rap artists tried to keep other artists in check when it came to their commercial pursuits, and some artists even defined themselves against commercialization. So you watch that video from EPMD, the crossover, at the beginning of the presentation, and EPMD is a great example of this because that single, that 1992 single crossover, helped make the idea of crossing over into the mainstream a kind of indictment within hip-hop. and you're seeing a little snippet from the lyrics of the song, and you can see that the lyrics equate the goal of selling a ton of records, of going gold, to selling your soul to the devil, or even being sold on the auction block, as PMD sort of provocatively suggests here in the lyrics. And, worse, crossing over meant that you were no longer hip hop, you were pop. And that was like the worst thing you could possibly be, because then you were the antithesis of hip hop. You were a pop sellout, which was like just the worst possible thing you could be. Now,
Professor?
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to ask you a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Go for
this
it.
came up a little bit earlier. It's from Maximilian, and I'm going to reframe it a little bit, but this sounds like it might be a good time to ask you to talk a little bit to us about the industry itself. Now, Max's question is really about the role of music executives and the ways in which they either, pushed the violence, the excessive violence through song versus the storytelling and the musical side. But maybe just let's broaden that question just to talk some in this sellout theme now about the industry itself. How did this commodification happen? What was the role of the executive and the industry and the labels at this particular period?
That's a complicated question. I mean, in the sense that commodification itself is a word that tends to sort of victimize hip hop. So there's a way in which the story of sort of the big label execs in their smoky boardrooms, that there's this way in which we think of that part of the industry as almost this villain in the story. And that hip hop becomes victimized in the way in which, hip hop gets picked up by big labels, sort of MC Hammer is like the best example of that. Sort of he, is this Oakland rapper who has a fantastic local career, and then he gets picked up by a big label and then becomes this platinum selling artist. And, according to guys like EPMD, becomes just, corny and dangerous in the sense that the popularity of somebody like MC Hammer seems to suggest that hip hop is watered down. It's whitewashed, and that is it's foreboding in the sense that it might mean hip hop is dying. And so the point at which these hip hop artists start to get major label deals in the late 80s and early 90s is a part of the standard narrative that is a turning point. That it seems like hip hop artists are sort of on these local independent labels like Def Jam or like Ruthless, for instance, and they're making a good go of it. And then when the major labels pick them up, then everything changes. But I think that this is part of the story that we need to re-examine, because I'm going to talk a little bit about Run DMC in a moment, but the story of Run DMC is a great way to sort of re-examine that and think about the fact that rappers early on had commercial success as one of their primary goals. And Run DMC and Russell Simmons as their manager. Russell Simmons is a very complicated character within this story. This was a big goal. I mean, Russell Simmons in his idea of what Run DMC was supposed to be, he wanted them to be hardcore and pop. He imagined them being major label commercial successes on MTV, selling millions, selling out stadiums. This is what he wanted for Run DMC, and to a certain extent, they succeeded. So, I'm getting around the question a little bit because it's one of those questions that I think is at the heart of why it's difficult to teach hip hop history, because
Good. Thank you so much for addressing that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can certainly address questions at the end if as we go through this, if there are lingering questions, or if we want to get into the weeds around the industry, I'd be happy to do that.
Sounds good.
Sure. But I mean, in terms of crossing over, I mean, the thing that we do know now is that hip hop is an entire genre. It ends up crossing over. So, by the early 2000s, hip hop is not the antithesis of pop music. I mean, really, it becomes synonymous with pop music. So, and this is part of that story. Like one of the things that we can't get around is the fact, if we have a judgment about that, we can't get around that. Hip hop, it crosses over. It becomes, it leaves the margins where it had been relegated for a long time, and where hip hop artists are really frustrated that they could not get out of the margins, that they could not land major label deals, that they couldn't get on radio, that they couldn't get on MTV. So, hip hop leaves those margins, it becomes pervasive, it's all over radio and video and fashion and slang and everything. But again, I think that in our classic telling of this story, this is the beginning of the end of the story of hip hop. Sort of after the golden era, there's this decline, and then the rest of the story is mostly, as I said, sort of foreboding, right? So this is the arc of the standard narrative. This is sort of how the history's been taught, with the bulk of our classes spent on the New York origin story, on those four elements, and then the golden era. And we tend to finish up things with a couple of weeks of discussion around hip hop's decline and things like its moral reckoning, obsession with wealth, questions about its future, misogyny. These kinds of themes tend to be the way that we wind up our classes on hip hop history. There were some I looked at a lot of syllabi, and there were some exceptions to this. There were a few outliers. Ibram X. Kendi, actually, at the University of Florida, he built his course around the songs featured in Shea Serrano's book, the Rap Yearbook, which features sort of the most important rap songs from each year, from '79 to I think 2012. Which was a unique course structure that really made a lot of sense, and I'd imagine gets students to really think about how rap changes year to year, and well past sort of the shiny suit era. I saw Catherine Jewell at Fitchburg State. She has expertise in college radio. I looked at her syllabi. She included sort of a section on historiography of hip hop scholarship, so she was looking at the history of how hip hop history has been written, which I had not seen in any other curriculum. So there were some outliers, but for the most part, virtually every syllabus I looked at, the overall arc of the story was pretty consistent and pretty simple. So 4 elements: golden era, commercialization, and then kind of reckoning. Now, the basic facts, right? The people involved, Kool Herc, Bambaataa, the fact that there was graffiti art involved in the sort of the original manifestation of hip hop within New York. Those kinds of things that holds up, right? There was, in fact, indeed, a profound kind of cultural innovation happening in the South Bronx in the late 1970s. Like, I'm not disputing that. Public Enemy asserting Black nationalism in the late 1980s, in its music and in its videos on MTV, that was radical. I'm not in any way disputing that. And, what groups like A Tribe Called Quest and De La Soul and Wu-Tang and, the late MF Doom even, what they were all doing lyrically and musically was really and truly cutting edge. These are absolutely critical historical figures within the story, no question. So it's not these basic facts that I think need to be reexamined as much as it's how we present them and how we structure the story and how we define what hip hop is and what it isn't. So how do we do that? How do we rethink these things? So the first important thing we can do is to scrap the 4 elements as a framework. And I realize this is controversial, and I've thought a lot about saying this, and frankly, a little concerned about the difficulty in asserting this. A lot of our hip hop history courses are grounded in this framework. A lot of hip hop scholarship is grounded in this framework. So this kind of suggestion and a potential change in the framework will require the most work on our part as teachers and as scholars. But I I will make the case that it's necessary for us to resist the urge to define hip hop in its essence as resting on these four pillars, on DJing and MCing and breakdancing and graffiti. It is 100% true that these things mattered in the local hip hop culture that developed in New York in the late 1970s and early 80s. But we now know that there were hip hop cultures developing simultaneously elsewhere in places like Oakland and LA and Houston and Miami that all evolved quite differently. These are other hip hop scenes that had at their foundation some similar elements, the DJ in particular, and to a lesser extent the MC, but not typically breakdancing or graffiti. So the pillars, in other words, vary widely. And in some cases, there weren't pillars at all, really. The music wasn't structured that way. I mean, even when you get deeper into it, you notice that even the term hip-hop as a signifier of the four elements culture is not used consistently when you move outside of New York. If you're from a place like Houston, or if you grew up in the Bay, like me, it's long been called rap. So it's referred to as Houston rap, or Bay rap, or Frisco rap, or LA rap. So even the terminology really varies. The four elements is, as you can see, it's fantastic for a logo, right? It's fantastic as a way to kind of package our nostalgia. But as a framework for researching and teaching hip hop history, it really limits us because we end up searching for those four pillars everywhere. And then, often, whether intentionally or unintentionally, dismissing the things that don't fit that mold. So I wanted to give you a concrete example of this to make my case. When I first started doing research for my book, I read what other hip hop scholars had said about LA. And the thing that kept coming up was this nightclub near downtown LA called The Radio. It had been featured in a 1984 documentary called Breaking and Entering, which you can find on YouTube pretty easily. It's pretty easy to find that. And it is actually the first time we see Ice-T on camera. And Ice-T gives the filmmaker this tour of The Radio, of this club in downtown LA, where he performs his freestyle raps. And you can see in the club these big bubble letter graffiti backdrops, and there are breakdancers performing, and there are MCs battling, and DJs are scratching, and the crowd is super, super mixed. Lots of kids of color, lots of white kids together. So, really reflecting what we think of when we think of like the cultural diversity of LA. And also reflecting what we might imagine we'd see at the cool clubs in like Soho in New York at that time. So, according to the documentary, and later, according to hip hop scholars, The Radio, this club downtown that I just described, supposedly provided us a way to understand the roots of LA hip hop. And it makes sense, right? Because if you see hip hop as defined by the four elements and as something that's fully baked in New York before it spreads west, then The Radio fits that narrative perfectly. But knowing what I knew about LA, having grown up on the West Coast and having consumed LA rap for decades, and also having grown up in the Bay and, within that hip hop scene and the way that hip hop scene developed, I wasn't so sure that The Radio was the full story. And so I peeled back the layers, and what became clear to me was that The Radio, it looked like this perfect slice of New York because that's precisely what the owner of The Radio, Alex Jordanoff, what he wanted. Jordanoff was this French immigrant who had come to LA by way of New York, and he had fallen in love with the New York downtown club scene, and then moved to LA to open up his own club. And when he did that, he sought to recreate as best as he could that New York aesthetic. So he commissioned artists to do these colorful, these graffiti murals for the club, and he booked MCs, and he booked DJs, and he booked breakdancers, breakdancers that he could find, most of which were kids who had come west from New York. So Jordanoff wanted The Radio to replicate exactly what he experienced in New York, right? So he wanted a taste of New York in LA, and he made that. So, from my perspective, I'm like, well, of course, scholars looking at this club thought, okay, cool, here's the four elements, there it is, this is the story about LA rap. And then, Ice-T has a memoir, and he talks about his role in this documentary. He talks about the radio, and what he says essentially is that he gave them what they were looking for. They were looking for something that looked like the Bronx, and so he staged that for them. Now, what that filmmaker and later what early hip hop scholars missed entirely was that at the very same time in the early 1980s, there was something else going on in LA. In the southern part of LA, there was this thriving dance scene, and almost exclusively Black dance scene, by the way, that revolved around the mobile DJ, revolved around these DJ crews, these extensive DJ crews, and revolved around local gang culture, and not around breakdancing, but around something that locals called freak dancing. And the whole thing was this truly West Coast phenomenon, the way these mobile DJ crews were using drum machines and synthesizers and vocoders. They were using all this stuff live to create fast-paced, electronic-inspired, bass-heavy music, which they called hip-hop, even though it didn't sound like the hip-hop coming out of New York at the time. And this is early 80s. This is like 82, 83, right? So we know what New York hip-hop sounds at that time, and what guys like Egyptian Lover and Roger Clayton were making at these parties at the same time sounded very different, but they were calling it hip-hop. And so, these guys were playing huge venues. They're playing up and down the coast in Oakland and San Francisco, and of course all over LA. And they're playing for sometimes crowds of thousands, as you can see here in this photo from an early Uncle Jem's party dancing. This is at the LA Sports Arena, actually. And this is actually years before it was common for rappers to tour big venues and to pull crowds of that size. So this is a big deal. Right? So this is special. Now, I'm researching this and I'm thinking, how do you look at a place like LA in the 1980s and completely miss this fascinating piece of hip hop history? And the answer is the four elements. I mean, if this is the recipe you're looking for, then you are not likely to see the relevance of something like this or to recognize this as hip hop at all, because, there aren't breakdancers. Graffiti, that colorful cartoonish art that you see on subway cars in New York, that's not part of the aesthetic of these dances. And, frankly, it's not even part of the aesthetic of urban LA until the late 1980s. And even the MC isn't a staple yet. A lot of these DJ crews, Roger Clayton talked about this a lot of them saw rapping as something that was, kind of boring, that it dragged down the party, that, it didn't help them keep dancers dancing, that it was a liability in a certain way. And they didn't need MCs because they as DJs were the headliners. So again, something really different. So LA's early hip hop culture, right, it doesn't rest on these four elements at all. And it's not, as it turns out, it's not baked in that New York mold the way that, we might think it is if we look just at the radio. And that reality, when we kind of, when we see things a little bit more clearly, it gives us a clue that the wider history of hip hop might be far more interesting and far less formulaic than we might think. Plus, this is really important, I think, and we're studying a place like LA can just be a start. It can help give us a new perspective on hip hop history as a whole. By letting go of the four elements as the basis for how we teach hip hop history, then it is just much easier for us to help our students see that distinct hip hop cultures emerged from different places and had at their foundation unique traditions. So, you let go of the four elements, and then you can create space in your teaching for things like the brass band and the second line in New Orleans, or something like car customization and slabs in Houston, or, it opens you up to, especially in the college classroom, maybe not in the high school classroom, but it opens you up to talk about how, for instance, the economy of sex work in Oakland was the basis for early rap music, and relatedly, like the local trade and street tapes in the region. That's part of the story. And of course, in LA, if we are no longer searching for the four elements, then we're better able to recognize the significance of things like roller skating, right? So one of the articles in your reading is about a Compton roller skating rink called Skateland that played a critical role in the rise of gangster rap, as you'll read. And I also recommended that HBO documentary United Skates, which covers a longer history of Black skate scenes throughout the country, including in LA and in the Midwest and in the South. So what I'm arguing is that if we can look beyond the four elements, then we will see more. I mean, that's like the real takeaway here. And crucially, we'll start to see these other scenes as equally important in terms of the fabric of hip hop history, and not just sort of offshoots that, we just kind of box out and we talk about, here and there, but really it will allow us to weave them into the history. And I would say for a field that intersects with studies of race and gender and social justice, removing the boundaries of the four elements also means that we're privileging more perspectives, and things just get more interesting that way. The second related thing we can do, so in addition to sort of removing ourselves from the boundaries of the four elements, the second thing we can do for our students, I think, is to help them better reframe how we talk about the New York origin story. So instead of making New York the center of the whole story, we can teach it as a regional history and one, not the only, but one significant early stage in hip hop's evolution. So still profoundly significant, but not the center of the entire 40-year history, right? So if we teach New York's hip hop history that way, especially with things like regional culture and geography at top of mind, then it gives us a way to discuss that historical context more deeply, like the specific legacies of things like, sort of neighborhood displacement and the influences of things like Caribbean culture or the subways, right? We can talk about New York hip hop, New York culture, this part of the evolution of hip hop in a way that doesn't require us to then try to find the same things everywhere else. If basically what I'm saying is we want to look at New York on its own terms. And then, relatedly, we want to turn around and look at other regions on their own terms, and then put it all together. We can also, I think, re-examine the old hip-hop history by considering the potential pitfalls of our own nostalgia. So the way nostalgia itself can kind of box us in as teachers, right? And I will be the first one to say that this is a tough one, especially for those of us who grew up with this music and are nostalgic for, this very past that we're trying to teach, right? This is tough. It's tough to pull apart our own mythologies and see what holds up. And hip hop's golden era, this is a prime site for nostalgia. It is so celebrated that we end up judging everything since the everything after the golden era as somehow lesser, right? If we could only go back to this better era, right? Which, when we're teaching hip hop, is not a great way to help students understand that past. We might help them pass judgment on it, but we might not be helping them fully understand and engage with that past. And I would say this too, that we have to be careful because teaching the golden era the way that we have been, I think, says to our students that rap music they are experiencing now isn't as significant. So we risk disconnecting this history from their present and from their experiences. What I think we should be doing is we should be impressing upon our students that this history, hip hop history, like history generally, is, it isn't for us to glorify. It's just messy, and we have to sort of treat it as it is, as being this messy, complicated thing. So the Reagan era, for instance, this is an era with a whole bunch of contradictions, right? There's a lot of conspicuous consumption, in everything from fashion to video games. We're talking about money. right in the midst of rising poverty and things like insider trading scandals, and labor unions are experiencing big losses. So there's a lot of contradiction there, and that historical backdrop, helps us make sense of the fact that golden era rappers were themselves kind of contradictory. I mean, there were rappers who were quote unquote conscious, but also misogynistic. There were rappers who were defiant, in terms of the industry, but were also very deliberately tapped into systems of capitalism. EPMD, by the way, the group that railed against the crossover, their group name is an acronym for Eric and Parrish Making Dollars. So, it's complicated, right? It's messy. And in the case of the Beastie Boys, who, I think have benefited more than any other hip hop group from nostalgia and mythology, I mean, they arguably, more than any other rappers of that time, and I include gangster rappers in this statement, they reflected the era's rigid gender norms and its aggressive machismo and its backlash to feminism in very real ways, and they represented, at that time, cultural appropriation long before guys like Vanilla Ice. So, it's complicated, right? So dealing with that messiness, I think, is something that we should try to do. The third thing that we can do to update and improve our hip-hop history curriculum, I think, is to re-examine the history of the crossover. That standard arc of the story, that standard narrative, as I mentioned, is that after the golden era, hip-hop crosses over and it's forever changed. It becomes sort of disconnected from its roots, from those four elements. And Andy, as you said, it's quote-unquote commodified, right? It becomes a commodity, becomes just, for the highest bidder. The music industry in this story takes control of hip-hop, and hip-hop loses its power. So that's part of our standard narrative. So again, as I mentioned earlier, it's like market forces are the villain and hip-hop is the victim in this story, which again is sort of a wonderfully easy story to tell. But it's not exactly accurate. Again, things are a lot messier than they seem, and that is okay. That is what history is. It's complex. It takes some time to sort of sift through all the different parts of the story. And I think Run DMC is a great way for us to explore this and for us to explore it with our students, because in the early 1980s, as I mentioned, this is way before any rap artist really goes mainstream. This is way before Hammer, way before guys like Dr. Dre, way before, the mid-90s when things really blow up. 83, 84, the members of Run DMC, and again, Russell Simmons, their very messy manager, he is the subject of one of the documentaries I recommended, On the Record. The subjects of that documentary accuse him of sexual abuse. So it's a heavy documentary, but it really helps us sort of think critically about the industry and in lots of different ways, including the industry that we sort of end up celebrating as part of the golden era. So they're all in the early 80s deliberately marketing themselves for this crossover, right? They fashion themselves as quote unquote street rappers long before gangster rappers do this. They use that term. This is a term that is part of their marketing. And they're also simultaneously aiming for pop audiences. So this is really actually very revolutionary. It's very new for an artist to sort of aim for this street aesthetic, but then also aim for pop audiences. And they succeed. They become the first rap group to go platinum, the first rappers to play stadiums, the first to get played on MTV. And they continually adapt their brand for the market. So their collaboration with Aerosmith, right, that famous collaboration for Walk This Way in 1986, this is usually cited as a favor that Run DMC does for Aerosmith, who at the time, the Aerosmith's career is kind of dying. But it was also, for Run DMC, this very savvy move to better position themselves to get more airplay on MTV. which at the time in '86 still had a mostly white male audience. So there's a way in which the story of Run DMC helps us understand the complicated relationship that rappers had from the inception of hip hop with market success. And the other thing I'll say is that what's important historically is that the way Run DMC succeeds, the way they blend their quote-unquote street rap brand with their pursuit of pop success, the way that they succeed in doing that, that lays the groundwork for gangster rappers and everything that comes after. So Run DMC as historical figures really help us rethink that standard story arc, and I think help us make it make more sense to our students if we can help them see this part of the story. And then of course there's NWA, right? I mean, the story of NWA is usually one that revolves around that controversial song of the Police, and that's of course a significant piece of their history. But the larger story of NWA and of early LA rap as a whole is a story about crossing over. I mean, my book, the sort of larger argument of it is a story about the way in which rap music as a whole, the way in which the genre crosses over, and why that is significant in terms of how American culture changes. And this goal of crossing over was at the core of what NWA really was, and what Eazy-E specifically wanted for his group, and what he envisioned for LA rap as a whole. So I talk a lot in my book about how radio specifically had no interest in hip hop throughout the decade of the 80s. Like until the late 80s, radio sort of blacked out hip hop. And MTV until 1988 doesn't create much space for the genre, with the exception of a couple of artists, including Run DMC. And cultural institutions like the Grammys didn't even adequately acknowledge hip hop as a musical genre until the 1990s. So these guys in LA were fighting at this time to get recognition. So they wanted to chart, they wanted to be on the Grammy stage, they wanted to be on magazine covers, as Eazy-E was fond of, showing in like in a meta way in his press photography. He'd like to hold up a magazine to sort of brag, people are paying attention to us. They wanted to reap the benefits of the entertainment industry, right? They wanted to do that. They wanted to be millionaires. They wanted to be famous. They wanted to be celebrities. And they wanted the nation to pay attention to what they had to say. So these are compatible goals, right? These are not goals that are incompatible. They wanted a platform for speaking out about things like living in a police state. They wanted to be able to rap about what it's like living in LA, living in the supposed Black Promised Land, where, Daryl Gates was chief of police and the LAPD was using things like the battering ram in drug raids in residential neighborhoods. Like they wanted a platform to talk about this stuff freely. So they wanted to make money, right? They wanted to cross over in that way. They wanted to sell records. They wanted cultural power too, and this is part of that project. So when we talk about commodification, we have to remember that these artists, yes, they did want success. They did want material success. They wanted to sell records. They wanted to make money. They wanted to see the fruits of their labor, but they also wanted cultural power. Specifically, they wanted the kind of cultural power that Black youth like them did not normally have, right? So these are really, I think another takeaway here is that, seeking to cross over and seeking cultural power for these guys, these were compatible goals. These were not in opposition. And what NWA does, what makes them historically significant is that they use their art to create a pathway for other Black youth, especially Black youth like them, to sort of be and say whatever they wanted to and to have a captive audience for it. Now, again, this story itself is very messy, right? Especially when you add in details about how the members of NWA, as much as they sought to expose the public to what they experienced living under the LAPD, They also played the tabloid game. They also used violence against women, and they sometimes, they hid behind the First Amendment sometimes. All of these things, these things reveal, as much about these guys as it does about entertainment culture in the 1980s and 1990s, right? So, rebellion during this period isn't always straightforward, and rebellion in this specific case of NWA isn't without its contradictions, but it still is something that we should examine in the context of the crossover, right? Rebellion in hip hop is often tied to the commercial mainstream. And when we teach hip hop history and we talk about the music as radical, as having something to say, we can't separate out the drive many artists had and have for mainstream success, right? So, I started the presentation with that image of YG, that screenshot from his video that he filmed in LA. That protest in downtown LA, which was, partly staged for the video, but it's also, this video FTP was done in the context of these George Floyd protests. So there's a way in which, yes, it's a video, yes, it's produced, yes, he's selling records, yes, he's a hugely popular mainstream rapper, but it's also, he also has this powerful platform to say something that is very much part of the zeitgeist. It's very much part of, is speaking to the kinds of protests that are happening all over the country. So those two things, I think, have to be dealt with in conjunction with one another. The other thing I'll say is that hip-hop, frankly, was never punk music, in the sense that hip-hop was from its inception about entertaining and about gaining fans and about getting record deals, right? So there are always going to be outliers. There are underground scenes that thrived then and continue to thrive in the spirit of punk music, in defiance of commercial pursuits. Of course, people have mentioned MF Doom's recent passing in the chat. He is a fantastic example of that, of an outlier here. But the genre of hip-hop historically as a whole has been commercially driven. And I think we make a mistake when we don't consider that in how we tell the story of hip-hop. That pursuit of mainstream success isn't incompatible with hip-hop. It ultimately makes it central to American culture. And by doing that, it amplifies the voices of the marginalized, and that's something I think is important for us to consider. So I'm keeping an eye on the time. I just have a couple of more things to say, and then I would love to hear some questions, answer your questions.
Great.
I offered up the performance of Kendrick Lamar on the Grammy stage in 2016. I write about this performance in my book in the conclusion. This is a great way to illustrate some of the things I've talked about. He's on the Grammy stage. He is, he is doing something that is itself a product of the crossover, right? Being on the Grammy stage, having access to that stage, is a product of that phenomenal success of hip hop over the last 3 decades. That's something that hip hop earns for itself, and he uses his performance in 2016, during that election year, he uses it to depict Black incarceration, as you can see. He uses it to comment on white violence. He uses it to nod to the protests in Ferguson after that police killing of Michael Brown. And he uses it, as you can see on the right-hand side, he uses it to spotlight his African and his Compton heritage proudly, right? So, this is a performance that cannot be understood through the lens of the 4 elements. It cannot be understood without a full understanding of the scope of LA's rap history, of that regional rap history. And it doesn't make sense within a history that sees commercialization as hip-hop's death knell. So, this video alone, if you're not going to read or look at any of the materials in the pre-reading, just watch this performance, because it is my best argument to you in favor of updating our curriculum. And the last thing I'll say is, in addition to studying LA, there are other ways that we can update our curriculum, think about other topics that could enrich hip-hop history if we allow ourselves to sort of let go of the old boundaries. So for instance, I included an article about Big Frida and New Orleans bounce music. And, we could be exploring at the center of our hip-hop curriculum things like queer identity in New Orleans bounce music and the lineage of artists like Big Frida. We could be thinking about the long lineage of an artist like Megan Thee Stallion, who's, she's these representations of women's empowerment that are as controversial as they are effective, right? There's a book coming out this spring by a scholar named Regina Bradley, who is from Georgia. Her book's called Chronicling Stankonia, and this is, it's part memoir, it's part cultural study, and she's looking at the South. She's trying to sort of help lay the groundwork, I think, for other scholars to recenter hip-hop history with a focus on the South. So that's very exciting. We should be looking out for that, coming out in a couple of months. There's also an exciting book coming out in the fall by Eric Harvey, who's a professor and journalist out of Michigan. It's called Who Got the Camera? And great title, if you're familiar with Ice Cube. And it's focused on the relationship between reality rap and reality media, which, I think is, again, a way to think about the history of rap in the context of popular culture of the era, in the context of the way in which media changes in the 80s and the 1990s. So something else to look out for. I would love to see somebody write a book about the Bay Area rap, especially something like the hyphy movement in the context of perhaps gentrification. I think that's long overdue. I started with Nipsey Hussle and YG, who, each openly identify with LA Bloods and Crips. Of course, Nipsey died in 2019, but before he died, he was known to be affiliated with the Crenshaw set of the Crips, right? So there are ways that we can help students understand the influence of gang culture on rap music and the ways that rap artists have, through their music, through the way that they branded themselves, to help transform popular ideas about gangs and gang culture. And this is something I tried to do in my book. I know Eric Harvey is exploring this in Who Got the Camera, and I think it's something else worth considering, worth thinking about in terms of our curriculum. But yeah, I mean, there are endless topics that we could explore to give hip-hop history curriculum just more complexity and just to teach it like it is, like it's messy, like it's layered and complicated. And I think this is a way, if we teach it that way, that we can help our students gain better perspective, not just on the past, but on their present. So yeah, I would love to hear some questions, comments. Anything?
Thank you so much, Felicia. And we do have some questions and comments. We have about 10 minutes left, and I think we can fit in a handful. And I would encourage all of our audience to continue to add questions to the Ask Professor Viator tab. But here's the first question, and it's one that's come up a couple of times in different ways. So I'm going to combine all those and ask you to talk a little bit with us about the role of women in hip-hop, partly as a way to disrupt the narrative, as Tisha in Connecticut suggests, but perhaps also in the sense of the misogyny of the early hip-hop culture. Tell us more about the role of women.
Right. So, women have been central to not just hip-hop music, but in hip-hop production. So again, I recommend that On the Record documentary, because it is a story about how women are, one of the main women featured in the film was an A&R representative. And, so you can see, even in that one documentary, ways in which women were involved from the inception of hip-hop in very important ways that we don't always notice when we're just looking at the videos, we're just looking at the artists that ultimately, rise and are getting record deals. I've thought about a lot of this in terms, I've thought a lot about misogyny in particular in terms of gangster rap and in terms of women involved in it and the way in which women consume it. And yeah, as a historian, I think about gangster as a concept that is pretty old. You know, it's this concept of the outlaw, so somebody that doesn't have traditional forms of power that's trying to get power by any means necessary. And I think the way that I've tried to make sense of women being involved in gangster rap as artists, as fans, as consumers, you know, behind the scenes in production, at labels, I think it has to do with the way in which the gangster is both a hero for men and a hero for women in terms of, you know, seeking power by any means necessary. And so I think there's something alluring about that that's not just alluring for men but also for women. But, you know, it is, misogyny is part of the music. It is part not just of gangster rap, but as I showed you, it's part of like early rap music. I mean, you know, this is part and parcel of this culture from early on. I think it's a bit of a red herring. I mean, I think we definitely need to think critically about the way in which women are treated, not just within the music, but in real ways within the industry. I think this is part of the messiness of hip hop history. But I hesitate to make it the center of the story because I think that the misogyny within hip hop, especially in the 1980s, and I mentioned the Beastie Boys, misogyny within hip hop, I think, is very much reflective of misogyny in the culture writ large. And so when I teach it, when I talk about the way in which women are depicted in the music, I try to give some historical context to that. So I try to, you know, give historical context in terms of like the backlash to the feminist movement in the 1980s, or you know, in terms of the way in which Black women were depicted in film and in TV and in tabloid media. And how, you know, we see reflections of that in hip hop. So it's a tough topic, I think, but again, worth exploring, worth including within the curriculum of hip hop to make sure that you know, we explore that messiness. Yeah.
Well, actually, let me follow up with John. A question
Sure.
from John, who asks, in your opinion, is there actually a double standard, even by the question, not the question that was asked tonight, but this notion of misogyny? Because, you know, classic rock, 70s rock culture was all about, you know, objectifying women. So is there a double standard even for that to be a central piece?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is. So I'm hesitant to say scapegoat because there is a real problem in the way in which Black women are treated within hip hop. There is, you know, and not just in the lyrics, not just in the subject matter, but behind the scenes in particular, and the way in which, you know, women get exploited within the industry, and that has real, you know, implications for how women can be involved. I think. But there is a double standard in terms of, you know, thinking about hip hop as this music that is somehow culturally dangerous, and how you know, we pin that on hip hop in ways that we don't on, you know, classic rock, as you mentioned, or on things like hair metal or heavy metal, or, you know, punk music, or, you know, other music genres that also, you know, have to contend with misogyny within the genre. So yeah, I think there is a very clear and almost egregious double standard there. So it's part of the reason why, you know, this is something I dealt with in my book, in terms of Dr. Dre's assault on V. Barnes, and how this, you know, this was part of NWA's image. It's part of their brand. You know, this, their sort of gangster image ended up resulting in real violence that they were using toward people, including women. But there's also a story in there about JJ Fad and the fact that like JJ Fad and this all women rap group that was on Ruthless Records, JJ Fad was really the reason why NWA even had the funds, why Ruthless Records like had the motivation to put out Straight Outta Compton. So women in hip hop are important in lots of different ways, and not just as victims. So it's yeah. I think it's fair to say that there's a double standard there, and I think a lot of hip hop scholars and hip hop artists end up having to answer for all genres when it comes to that.
Right.
But yeah, it's a tough question, and I appreciate it.
Two more questions before we have to conclude tonight. You've talked a lot tonight about your book and about your research. Tell us, and of course, are the teachers in the audience also try to replicate that process to some degree by using the primary sources and the research source work that you use in your own work. Tell us about some of the primary sources that you use to write your book. What kinds of things, just generally speaking, what did you use to construct your evidence?
Great question. I get a lot of my students ask me this all the time because I think they assume that a book about hip hop will be based 99% on the music, on the lyrics, right? So they think a book about hip hop is like mostly lyrical analysis, and in fact, I of course think about the music. Music is very much, I just talk about the music, I describe the music, I talk about the lyrics, I analyze the lyrics. Music is certainly crucial in terms of the primary sources that I use, but I'm also looking at music video. I'm looking at music journalism. Music video was really important for me to examine because, in the case of NWA in particular, and a lot of hip hop artists in the late 1980s, they were dealing with the fact that radio wasn't airing rap. And so when MTV came about, a lot of these artists had to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? NWA in particular was thinking like, we need to get attention to this music. So one of the ways that we could do this is we could sort of replicate what filmmakers are doing. We can tell our story with these images. We can take advantage of this new media. And they do that expertly, especially with Straight Outta Compton. I mean, they're using that video Straight Outta Compton not just to illustrate the lyrics to that song and to sort of show viewers what it looks like to live in LA under a police state, but they're also trying to create some sensation, right? They're trying to, MTV bans the video, and this, Ice Cube is frustrated with this, and he goes on sort of he gives a lot of interviews frustrated with MTV for banning the video, but this is also really good for them. It generates controversy that helps them. It helps their brand. It helps get attention to their other records. So I look at music video, and then I looked a lot at music journalism. Music journalism evolved, especially around hip-hop journalism, evolved very quickly in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, so I had a lot of material there to look at. A lot of the artist interviews that I used were especially precious to me because, interviewing artists now, I think, would be fantastic, and you get some interesting perspectives when the artists are sort of thinking back to that time, but getting a snapshot of what they were thinking at that moment when they're like 19, 20, 21, and they're experiencing the rise of their own career as it's happening, that stuff was really important to me to understand what was going on in their minds, what their strategies were, what their goals were, and how they saw themselves fit into everything else that was going on during that period. So music journalism, music videos, those, I would say that was sort of the heart of the research, in addition to lots of other things like, I looked at police records, I looked at the records of Tom Bradley, the mayor of LA, things like telegrams from people who are sending information about the LA uprising in 1992. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of sources that I used. And that's one of the advantages of researching hip hop, especially researching something so current, is that you kind of have so many options.
Okay, I got one last question for you, okay. Felicia.
Yeah.
I don't want any context. I just want you to tell us 3 records you're listening to right now. Leave us with 3 recommendations.
Okay, so I've been listening a lot to a rapper named P-Lo, who's from the Bay. He's from Richmond in the Bay Area. So P-Lo. I listen to he's not new, but newer. I really love Schoolboy Q. I think he's doing some fascinating stuff that's really he has a video called John Muir that I think, if you watch the Straight Outta Compton video, go and watch the John Muir video, Schoolboy Q, John Muir, and, think about perspective, think about imagery, think about, LA as a landscape. He does some really interesting stuff, not just in his music and his production, but also in his music videos. And then I still listen to a lot of old soul. That's kind of my wheelhouse. I love The Time, and one of my most precious records is a Time single, 779311, which is like probably my favorite song ever. And so, I can never get enough of that record, and I put it on time to time. So some new, some old. So those are the 3.
Professor Felicia Viator, thank you so much for spending your evening with us, or your late afternoon at least. I would encourage everybody to pick your book up. Felicia, thanks again.
Thank you. Yeah, no problem. Thank you all for spending the time. Take care.
And I want